Okay, so thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, and I have to start with a little disclaimer because the title of my talk is a little bit misleading. Looking for the crucial points, because I won't tell you anything about points, dots, or full stops today. I'm looking for two other punctuation units that are exciting as well. I hope to show that to you today, so that hopefully is the only disappointment together with my talk. So let's start off by looking for the crucial point. And I want to start with somewhat special because I want to start with a poem. It was published in German, but I believe you will still be able to understand it because I translated it and it isn't that difficult to understand. The title is The Poem, and it reads as follows: I lay out punctuation, now I'm waiting. That's the whole text. I really like this poem because it breaks with our normal expectations we have of punctuation. Our normal idea probably is that we write a text and then add punctuation units or do so while we are writing. The punctuation units are therefore often seen as a surplus, as an add-on. And here, this is different. The punctuation units prepare the text. They are the central object. And this idea to make punctuation units the central object isn't particularly old in linguistics either. And this is true, even most writing systems of the world indeed have some kind of punctuation units, which look quite similar often. Pioneering work in this field was carried out in particular by Nunberg in 1990 for English and Ursula Bredel for German in 2008. And the basic idea, especially of the latter study, is that punctuation units are reading aids. So they are designed for the needs of the readers. And this makes also clear why they are seen as a surplus sometimes, because they don't help us writing directly. We insert them as aids for our readers. And of course, we are readers of our own texts as well. The two mentioned studies, Nunberg and Bredel, have primarily focused on the system behind the punctuation units. And they have succeeded in modelizing such a system convincingly. Another question, of course, related to that is the one about the specific usage of punctuation units. And that's the question I want to address here. So what do writers actually do when they use punctuation units while writing? That's the basic question of my talk, and it is structured as follows. First, I would like to say something about the databases of my corpus-driven study. Those are A-level exams, so exams written by students leaving school. And I think that might be a bit surprising that I think that they are actually pretty bad databases for such a corpus-driven study. But I think they're still the best one available for me. I will make that clear in a moment. And then I will make some very brief observations on the use of the brackets and the quotation marks in German, which should only illustrate the insights that such a corpus-driven study can lead to. And in a third step, I would then like to conceptualize these results in a multi-perspective way and show what this means for punctuation research and also for grapholinguistics as a whole. But first, let me start with the database. When we want to find out something about written language in use, we, at least in Germany, normally look at large corpora containing professionally produced texts, such as newspapers, magazines, or books. One problem is that they have all usually gone through final editing. So what we see when we look at those corpora is something like the combined use of the writers and the editors. Yes. It's written here. In the case of corpora consisting of internet texts, they aren't professionally edited, but it is unclear to what extent the users did use spell checkers or AI text generation. This may be negligible due to the size of such corpora, but it is precise such large internet corpora that do not contain a temporal dimension. So I cannot examine internet texts from 1900 for obvious reasons. So I cannot make any statements about change or progressions. Corpora of learners are interesting, but they are ruled out for many questions where the use of competent writers at the end of their education is relevant. And that is my point. I would like to see the authors of A-level exams, in German Abiturprüfung, basically the last exam you're writing when you are leaving school, is exactly that, as competent writers. This may seem surprising at first glance, but they are writers at the end of their institutionally imparted orthographic training, and it is in precisely this sense that they are competent. And the biggest advantage of these A-level exams as a text basis is their diachronic comparability. Even 100 years ago, a student wrote his or her A-level exams under comparable conditions. And this is central here, students want to write an orthographic correct text throughout. An A-level exam is a major test. You can also call that high stakes test. So they are written in a fully regulated orthographic space, and we can assume that the students want to get everything right without additional aids. So what we are seeing there is actually unfiltered authentic use. That is my claim. And that's why I examine this in a large text corpus containing of such A-level exams. It's called the Graf-Var corpus. And it contains German A-level exams written between 1917 and 2018 at the moment. We have around 2,500 more A-level exams scanned, but not already inside the corpus. For this presentation, I will restrict this temporal dimension to the period after the Second World War, because fewer papers are available before that. And we have German exams included in the corpus, as well as biology exams and history exams, and they behave differently. I will show you that a little bit later. The key question before I turn to the actual punctuation units is the comparability of the data for many reasons. I will address the most important ones. The first one is that there are more and more texts. We have 52 exams in the 1948 edition and 167 texts in the 2018 edition, and these texts are getting longer on average. We can take these both factors into account by relativizing the use to the specific frequency, and that is why I will only show relative values today. More important are demographic developments. In the past, only a small proportion of the, of course, male population completed A-level exams. Today, this figure is around 30% in Germany. You can see the development right here. This point is due to a systematic change in the German educational system, so that in this year, students that were 12 years in school and students that were 13 years in school both wrote their A-level exams in the same year. And the second point that limits the comparability should therefore be kept in mind is the changing framework conditions of the text writing process, typically called task environment. Take a look at a typical task from 1952. What thoughts are prompted by the poet's words? A person that is not developing anymore is finished and can do no right. A person that is developing will always be grateful. If I was a student in 1952, I would probably have failed that. I have no idea what they wanted to hear, but that's, of course, something completely different when you compare it with 2013. Interpret the excerpt from chapter 5 of Theodor Fontane's novel Irrungen, Wirrungen, examine the extent to which Friedrich Schiller's tragedy Kabale und Liebe serves as a model for this excerpt from the novel. That's my mistake, probably. The difference is obvious. In the past, it was a so-called reflection essay, in German Besinnungsaufsatz, which did not primarily intend to test specific subject content, but instead to show that the students are capable of taking up a course of study regardless of the specific subject area. Today, a more or less scientific text is required, and that is something completely different. Please keep these two factors in mind when I show you some limited insights of my analysis. These are really brief excerpts of what I do, but they are mainly intended to show you the potential of such usage studies. And I've chosen to focus on two punctuation units in German, which always occur in pairs. If they are only realized once, then that's a mistake. It's about the quotation marks and the brackets. And I will start with the quotation marks. Since the groundbreaking study proposed by Klockow in 1980, we have known that there are basically two different ways of using quotation marks in German, the conventional use and the modelizing use. And we can see that the three subjects in the corpus differ here. Let's look at the conventional use first. These are instances of the so-called conventional use. It is characterized by the fact that there is an orthographic error when you do not realize these quotation marks. However, the message remains still the same. And this applies to the citation of other people's statements. He said no to pure quotations, the word and to the citation of titles and proper names. And we can see that the three subjects indeed differ here. In German exams, you can see that this is what you see when you see quotation marks in German exams. It's the conventional use. More interesting is what happens in biology and history, and this is about the so-called modelizing use. And they work differently. We now zoom in. We now zoom into the modelizing use. You know that figure already. We now zoom into the modelizing use. Here it is different. If you omit these quotation marks, there is no orthographic error, so no one would care, but the message changes. Typical example for that is an artist. Yeah, an artist is something different than an artist. Yeah, I think we can agree on that. So this is modelizing use. And here the quotation marks also behave conspicuously. In biology exams, we have what Klockow calls the reservation of content. And typical examples for that are electric potentials that jump. Yeah, so the subject of a sentence does not semantically map onto the verb of a sentence because the subject is abstract. That is typical for biology. And in history, it's comparable, but though these quotation marks often mark words that are problematic either way, mostly because these exams are about the National Socialism, and you have the students write words like race and all those kind of stuff. So that is reservation of content, and we see we can get, with the conventional quotation marks and the reservation of content, we can analyze history in German quite well. In biology, there is a gap, and that is what Klockow calls reservation of style or reservation of language. And this is often foreign words like Latin words that are used in biology that are marked with quotation marks. They deviate stylistically. And as a side note, writers show how competent they are by using those quotation marks because they notice that the words they're using deviate in the specific context. Okay, so overall, we can only agree what Klockow already said in 1980, which was also a corpus-based study on writing in 1980. And he told that the speaker does not fully identify within the marked expression of the quotation marks. Okay, that's one example for punctuation units. The second one are the brackets. Here too, we can distinguish between two types of use quite analogously. The first one is the construction, so-called construction bracket. It's the small cat is lying over there. So if you omit these brackets, there's no orthographic error. Yeah, it would work without the brackets. And that is different with the so-called commenting brackets. Reader, the smaller cat is lying over there. So there you would need some kind of marking the syntactic boundary. Okay, so let's look how these brackets are used in the exams. First, let's look at the temporal dimension. And we can see that brackets are becoming more and more frequent in these exams. You might find this quite boring, and I would understand that. But for me, it's exciting because most of the other punctuation units are becoming increasingly rare. So there are basically only the points, the dots, the commas, and the brackets who are becoming more frequent. And we can ask, does this apply to all subjects? And if I ask the question, the answer is probably no, and it is no. In biology, you can see it's a constant line. The frequency per 1,000 tokens is rather constant. In history, there is, okay, so in German, it's increasing. In history, it's something in between. So why is that? And we can explain that by looking what brackets are actually used by within these exams. The first result overall is that the construction bracket, the small cat, is nearly not seen in any of these exams, always under 7%. That's a statement about the system itself. And if we come across brackets in German, then there are commenting brackets, sorry. Okay, so what is going on then? If we look at biology and also to some extent history, those are classical commenting brackets, something like the electronic potential, then in brackets measured in, I don't know how you measure the electric potential, but you can look it up afterwards, something like that. So what is done in German and history? It's citation. That's also a kind of commenting bracket, but a special one. Therefore, I will call them citation bracket. And here you can see what I've told you about the task environments. Nowadays, you need to cite to produce more or less scientific text, and this is reflected within these exams. I will not talk about the rest. But this can be analyzed in similar way that Smerejani did. Smoke detectors go off when they detect smoke, but when a smoke detector goes off, this does not mean that the smoke detector has changed. What has changed is the smoke detector's environment or habitat. We submit that corpus-based linguists often face a similar issue in that fluctuating frequencies of grammatical variants are a function not only of changing grammars, but are also conditioned by environmental changes in the textual habitat. And this is what we see here. The brackets show precisely that, and we've seen something very similar with the quotation marks. They only exploit part of their systematic functional potential in this specific context, the smoke detector's environment, so to speak. And this tells us something about writers as well as about the punctuation units themselves. And I've only spoken about functions. I've left out the forms that should be taken in mind as well. Okay, so what follows? I would like to conclude by arguing that these results can be connected in various directions, namely the following. We can connect those findings with other usage-based studies. It is clear that we always see variation when we look at writing in use, but we can now use such results to recognize which variation is used and which is not in which context. It can be connected to the system of punctuation units as a whole, which functions and forms of punctuation units represent the core area, which are to be located in the peripheral area. If we realize that functions derived from systematic observations do not play a quantitative role, we may have to reconsider if our system reconstruction was correct. And also, with a view to grapholinguistics as a whole, what role do punctuation units in writing and, of course, reading as the other side of the medal? When are they used and why? How do they relate to standard concepts such as the grapheme? And why are they so successful in otherwise completely diverse writing systems? And this brings me directly to my last point, typological research. My observations were totally focused on German, but I'm of course standing in front of experts for a whole range of different writing systems. So maybe we can find a way to discuss the role of punctuation in the writing systems that you know and I don't have an idea about. I will only show one example that this could be interesting. It's from a study of two Swedish colleagues, Levin and Röhm-Herold, and they examined text written in German, in English, and in Swedish, and their respective translations into the other two languages. And they looked about how these translations dealt with the brackets. We've seen the first one, it's the German original, wenn ihr Kätzchen das höchstwahrscheinlich schon nicht tut. The English translation is, even though your kitten is most likely not going to share that feeling. What you can see here is what they call an update. So the brackets are replaced by the dashes. So the thing that's written within the brackets is promoted by putting it into the dashes. That's one strategy. We also see the exactly different way. I won't read the Swedish original because I'm not fluent in Swedish at all, but I will read the English translation. 20 or such cards, i.e. 10 or so pairs, are shuffled. Here, a comma, which is marking only the syntactic boundary, is replaced by the bracket, so the whole information is positioned in a side discourse, probably. Due to time limitation, I will now skip the second example, although it's about James Bond in Russian. You can ask me later what I wanted to say about that. Okay, that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I've told nothing about forms, but forms are also very exciting when it comes to punctuation units. And when you look at the Russian Wikipedia entry for James Bond, you can see that there are brackets and quotation marks. And for the brackets, it's here. I don't think you will be able to see it. We have the same form and the same function. So they look like in German or in the English Wikipedia, and they have the same function. For the quotation mark, this is different. They have the same function here, but they have another form. So that's one way these form and function relations could play out. I have investigated together with Dimitrios some punctuation inventories of the world, and we also see the other way around, so same form, different functions. But in the core, the most punctuation units are rather stable concerning forms and functions, and that is an observation we find very fascinating. Even though the writing systems we examined were very diverse, so there were logographic ones, morphographic ones, and still forms and functions seem to work pretty well in many writing systems.
I have a question. Have you attempted to correlate the statistics you got with the use of the same punctuation in the text? The students were exposed to like textbooks.
Yeah, I've tried it, but that's not, yes, I've tried, but it's actually pretty difficult because in many schools, we don't really know which school books they have read in 1950, 1940, 1920. So the farther you go below, that's it gets more difficult. And that's a basic problem of this whole study, because we don't exactly know what the students, what the lessons were and what the topic of the lessons were that those students attended before they wrote those freely produced texts. So I've tried it, and I will try it in my study if I publish it, but it's pretty difficult.
Yeah. You said that across many writing systems, the punctuation is quite similar, but my impression is that that might be due to the fact that many writing systems import the
heavily borrowed
from Latin or from Europe or so.
Yeah, the Western set is heavily borrowed, but it works. Yeah, so it's borrowed and it's taken into different writing systems, and it seems to work in many diverse writing systems, and that's fascinating, I think.
A clarification question, but when you mentioned brackets, are you talking about the round?
Yes, yes. I'm only talking about the round brackets because the others don't really appear that often in German exams. We have some very, very few examples for the, I don't really know the English word for that, square brackets. Thank you. But the others simply don't exist in those exams.